in this lesson, we'll talk about Databricks Jobs. So what is Databricks Jobs? So typically, when you are in the, writing some code as a user, you typically write your code in a form of a notebook. So you write your code as a notebook. And then you have tested this code, you tried usually in the development environment, which is a Databricks workspace dedicated for the development activity, like writing code, testing the code, experimenting things. It's where you write code for development purpose. Once you write the code and test it and make sure it's running fine, now you're ready to deploy your code. Deploying the code usually go towards the production environment. So in Databricks terms, also production environment is another Databricks workspace. But it's a different environment. And when you write the code, you deploy the code to the production environment, you don't really want this code to run one time. There is cases when you want it to run one time, but usually you wanted the code to run on a schedule, like periodically, because the data arrive from the source system in the same interval. Let's say your source system produces data every 1 hour, or every 2 hours, or every 24 hours, depending on the interval upon which the data arrives. Subsequently, you want your notebook also to run in the same interval. So how you do that? So you take your notebook and you go deploy it in the production environment and attach it with a schedule. Let's say every 1 hour, I want my code to run every 1 hour. And every 1 hour, let's say your code takes 10 minutes to run. So every 1 hour, your notebook will start to process the data for the duration of 10 minutes, and then your cluster shut down and wait, 50 minutes. And then another hour will kick in, so your cluster will start, process the data for 10 minutes, and then your cluster shut down, and then you wait 50 minutes again, and so on and so forth, right? This is what we call job in Databricks terms. So what is a job? It's a notebook that runs periodically, depending on your interval or your data arriving from the source system. Generally speaking, when you work with data coming from source system, you'll find that your data always comes in one or two forms. One form, we call it batch. A batch is your data arriving from the source system on an interval based. Let's say every 1 hour, every 24 hours, or every 1 day or week, depending on the interval that you look at the source system and decide, yeah, this source system, I'm happy to take the data every 1 week or every 1 hour, and so on. There is another type, we call it a stream. So a stream is not really data arriving on a specific interval, it's data continuously flowing from the source system 24/7, and usually in a small bulk of data. So it could be 10 records every 10 seconds, so 1 record per second, or 10 records per second, and so on, depending on the volume. But it's usually small volume that arrive continuously. While the batch, the volume could be big, could be 1,000 records every 1 hour, or 1 million records every 1 hour. There are systems that could generate, 1 million records every 15 minutes or 10 minutes, depending on how big is your source system. So so in order to process the stream data, you need a cluster that runs 24/7. That's always up and running to receive the data and process it. And so make it ready for you to build some analytics on top of it. But generally speaking, both types, when you create them on Databricks, we call it a job. That you create a job in order to process your data. How we can create a job from Databricks perspective? Let's go to the Databricks and see how we can do that. So if you go to your Databricks environment, this is where we are. We are in data science and engineering, right there. If you go to your notebook, so I'm going to my workspace, I'm going to my notebook, click home. I'm here in the Titanic. Let's pick one of the notebooks. I'm going to pick Titanic Bronze. So this is your Titanic. This is the code. Everything looked fine. You read the code, you tested it. It's perfect to go. So all I'm going to do here, at the top right, there's a schedule. So you click. I already created one before, but I'm going to add a new one. So you can create it add schedule. And here, Databricks will ask you a few things about this schedule. How often you want it to run, so I'm create schedule. You give it a name. Usually it takes the name of the notebook. Schedule, I want it every minute, every hour, every day, week, month. There is the frequencies that you specify. You select, for example, a day, every day at, and you specify the time, every day at 12 a.m. in the morning or 4 p.m. in the afternoon, depends on how often you want it to collect the data. And then you select a cluster for this notebook to run on. There is two types of cluster. As we know from the cluster lesson, there's two types of cluster inside Databricks. One called a job cluster and one called all-purpose cluster. So the all-purpose one, this is the typical cluster we want to create from the compute. So you create a cluster, specify the number of nodes, what is the runtime, all this option, it will be available. So this is the cluster you create, start, stop manually from outside the scope of a job. Or if you wanted your job, when it starts, to create its own cluster, and when it finishes, it destroys the cluster, so you don't get billed in between. Like I said, if your job is running every 1 hour and it takes 10 minutes to process, so typically you need your cluster to be available 10 minutes only, so you don't get charged for the whole hour. That's what we call a job cluster, which is bounded by the duration of execution of the notebook. And this is the best type you should always use when you run a job, because it's cheaper, cost effective, and it really does the job. You don't need a cluster to be run without doing anything. So I'm going to select this cluster, and you can add some options here about how should you get some notification. Yeah, notify me when it's started, when the job started, when it's successfully ended, or when there's a failure. After you check, you build all these parameters and options, and you click create. This is one way to create a job in Databricks, but this is not the only way. The other way is you go here and you click on workflows. You see, you go to the workflows, and you also can create a job. So here, more detailed in UI to give more information about your job. Let's say the other one was very condensed and to the point, where this is for advanced user who wanted to have more control about the job. So you give it a name, so I'm going to Titanic job. Here, you create a job. In Databricks, a job will create one task by default. So I'm going to create for this task, call it Titanic bronze. You can select what do you want to run this job. There's several options. You can write a notebook, a script, an SQL, so many stuff here you can choose. I'm going to choose a notebook. What is this notebook living? So the notebook is inside the workspace. I'm selecting the workspace. What is the path? I'm going to select the path. It's here in my username, Titanic folder. I'm going to select the bronze notebook. Confirm. Cluster, again, same thing. You choose a job cluster or a all-purpose cluster. I'm going to leave it a shared job cluster. And you add some, if you want to, if your job depended on some libraries, external libraries, you can add them here. Parameters, again, some parameters for your job. Email notification, like before, on success, on failure, when it started. How often your job needed to be retried. If your job failed, should Databricks retry it? And how many tries? Maybe try one time and fail, or 2 times, or 3 times. Keep retrying forever. If select limited, it will be forever retried. And finally, what is the time out? Like, when is your job times out? So you add all these parameters for your job, and once you are done, you create. Okay. What if your job, this is for pretty much the batch job. So if when you click create here, right? So let's say I will click create on this one. Then your job has been created. Now you can add the schedule from here. So after you create the job, add a schedule. What is the trigger type? It's scheduled. How often? This is the same interface. I wanted to run every day at, I don't know, 2:32. This is the time, so I'm going to save. So now I added a schedule. So my job will run at this interval every day, right? And this is the compute permissions. This is pretty much all the standard stuff. Now, if your job is a streaming job, that means it runs 24/7. Now, in that scenario, all you need to do is you don't need to add a schedule to your job. You just need to add the number of retries of your job here. So you go to number of retries, add, make it unlimited, confirm, and your stream, when you run your job, when it picks up the stream, the job will never stop anyway. So your cluster will literally start. So you're gonna need to trigger it the first time manually. So you're gonna trigger it manually the first time and leave it running forever in the production. If it failed, it will be automatically retried and started. So it will keep listening for the data flow that arrived from the source system. And that's how you create a stream cluster that runs 24/7. The other option is you choose a cluster that you manually make it run forever. So you click swap. So I'm gonna delete this, swap, and you choose an existing all-purpose cluster that is running outside the scope of the job. So this cluster is not bounded to the life cycle of the job. If you create a cluster, a job cluster, this cluster is created when the job is started, destroyed when the job ended. While the all-purpose cluster, it's always created outside the scope of the job. It's always living and running. Your job will start and end while your cluster is still running. So this is pretty much it for your for the job, and see you in the next lesson.